Imagine being born into one of the most famous families on earth, surrounded by palaces, cameras, royal ceremonies, and millions of people who believe they know everything about you. Now imagine that the person the world sees is not the person you are allowed to be. That was the extraordinary reality of Princess Margaret. For decades, Britain watched her grow up as the glamorous younger sister of Queen Elizabeth II. She was beautiful, fashionable, outspoken, sometimes rebellious, and seemingly determined to live life on her own terms. But behind the photographs, the royal appearances, and the headlines was a woman dealing with something far more complicated: love, duty, public expectations, loneliness, and a marriage that became one of the most closely watched relationships inside the British royal family. When Princess Margaret married Antony Armstrong-Jones in 1960, Britain saw a spectacular royal wedding. Millions watched. The couple appeared glamorous, modern, and exciting. Margaret was marrying a photographer rather than a traditional aristocrat. And for a moment it looked as if the princess had found a way to escape the restrictions of royal life. But the story that unfolded afterward was much darker and more complicated. The wedding itself was historic. Margaret was the first member of the immediate royal family to marry a commoner in centuries, and Antony was unlike the men the royal establishment normally expected to enter the family. He was creative, independent, socially unconventional, and Margaret was attracted to exactly that. She was not looking for a predictable life. She wanted excitement. She wanted romance. She wanted someone who could see the woman behind the title, and Antony seemed to understand that world. But there was a problem. Two strong personalities can create an extraordinary relationship, but they can also create an extraordinary collision. Margaret had spent her entire life under rules she had never chosen. She had grown up knowing that every romantic decision she made could become a national conversation. Every dress could become a headline. Every friendship could become gossip. Every argument could become a royal crisis. And when you are Princess Margaret, even private heartbreak has the potential to become public entertainment. At first, however, the marriage looked like a success. The couple became one of the most glamorous pairs in Britain. Their home became a meeting place for artists, actors, musicians, politicians, aristocrats, and celebrities. They represented a new kind of royalty. Margaret brought the royal mystique. Antony brought the artistic world. Together, they seemed to embody a changing Britain. But appearances can be incredibly deceptive. The more attention the couple received, the harder it became to protect their private lives, and Margaret's personality made that even more complicated. She was intensely emotional, fiercely proud, and capable of enormous charm, but she could also be demanding, impatient, and deeply sensitive. Antony was equally complicated. He valued freedom. He was surrounded by creative people. He had a life outside the palace. And he was not simply prepared to become Margaret's supporting character. That tension would eventually become one of the central problems in their marriage. To understand Margaret's marriage, you have to understand what came before it. She had already experienced a devastating love story with Peter Townsend. Townsend was a divorced Royal Air Force officer, and Margaret had fallen deeply in love with him. For a young princess who had spent her childhood watching her sister become queen, Townsend represented something precious, a relationship that felt personal rather than political. But royal rules and social expectations stood in the way. The relationship became a national controversy. Margaret ultimately announced that she would not marry Townsend. The decision changed her forever. Whether she truly wanted to give up the relationship or felt forced into accepting the realities of royal life remains one of the most debated aspects of her story. But imagine what that experience must have done to someone already struggling between personal desire and public duty. She had learned a painful lesson. In her world, love did not necessarily mean freedom, so when Antony entered her life, he represented something different. He was not Townsend. He was not a traditional royal, approved husband. He was exciting, artistic, unconventional, and apparently capable of standing beside a princess without being intimidated by her. That made the romance irresistible. The engagement surprised many people, and then came the wedding. On May 6, 1960, Princess Margaret walked into Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was spectacular. The world watched, Britain celebrated, and millions of people believed they were watching the beginning of a modern royal love story. But the wedding was only the beginning. Behind the scenes, both Margaret and Antony carried expectations that would eventually prove difficult to reconcile. Antony was given the title Earl of Snowdon, but a title could not erase the difference between their worlds. Margaret had been raised inside an institution. Antony had built his identity around creativity and independence. She had spent her life being watched. He had spent his life observing others through a camera. That difference was fascinating. It was also dangerous. As the years passed, their relationship became increasingly strained. There were long periods when they lived apart. There were rumors about infidelity. There were reports of arguments. And there was an increasingly obvious emotional distance. Yet the public image often remained polished. This is one of the most important parts of Margaret's story. Royal families do not simply experience personal problems, they manage them. A normal couple can have an argument and close the door. A royal couple has to consider newspapers, photographers, public opinion, constitutional expectations, family reputation, and the institution itself. Margaret could not simply disappear. Antony could not simply live like any other husband. Their private disagreements existed in a world where thousands of strangers felt entitled to know what was happening. And the British press was becoming increasingly interested in Margaret. She had become one of the most fascinating figures in the royal family. Unlike Queen Elizabeth, who cultivated an image of restraint and duty, Margaret was unpredictable. She could be glamorous, she could be controversial, she could be warm one moment and furious the next. She was, in many ways, easier for the media to turn into a story, and that attention placed enormous pressure on her marriage. The couple had 2 children, David and Sarah. For them, the situation was not simply about headlines. They were growing up inside a family whose private problems could become tomorrow's front page. The marriage eventually reached a point where separation became unavoidable. In 1976, Margaret and Antony announced their separation. 4 years later, their divorce was finalized. It was a landmark moment. A senior member of the royal family was divorced at a time when divorce still carried significant social stigma. And Margaret was once again at the center of a national conversation. But here's where the story becomes even more interesting. People often reduce Margaret's marriage to a simple story. They say she married the wrong man. They say Antony was unfaithful. They say Margaret was difficult. They say the marriage was doomed from the beginning. But real relationships are rarely that simple. Margaret was not simply a victim. Antony was not simply a villain. They were 2 complicated human beings living inside an incredibly complicated institution. Both had strengths, both had flaws, both made mistakes, and both were trapped, in different ways, by the expectations surrounding them. Antony later continued his career as a photographer, and remained an important figure in British cultural life. Margaret continued her royal duties, but the divorce did not erase their shared history. They remained connected through their children and through decades of memories. And Margaret's life after the divorce became another chapter in the story of a woman searching for something she had struggled to find since childhood. Freedom. She traveled. She attended parties. She surrounded herself with famous people. She continued to attract enormous attention. But beneath the glamour was a woman whose life was marked by emotional disappointments. Her relationships were constantly examined. Her lifestyle was criticized. Her friendships were discussed. Even her personal choices became public property. And this raises a fascinating question. Did Margaret actually want the freedom she appeared to have? Or did she simply want the freedom to be loved without being judged? Because those are two very different things. Princess Margaret could go to parties. She could travel. She could wear whatever she wanted. She could socialize with celebrities. She could live a glamorous life. But she could never completely escape being Princess Margaret. The title followed her everywhere. The cameras followed her everywhere. And perhaps most importantly, expectations followed her everywhere. This may explain why her marriage was so difficult. She was searching for a relationship that could give her emotional security, while also allowing her to remain herself. But marriage to a princess was never going to be ordinary. Antony had to live beside the institution. Margaret had to live inside it. Those are two very different experiences, and perhaps neither of them fully understood just how difficult that difference would become. There is also something else that is often overlooked. Margaret's public image was heavily influenced by the era in which she lived. In the 1950s and 1960s, women were expected to behave differently from how they are today. A woman who was outspoken could be called difficult. A woman who demanded independence could be called selfish. A woman who enjoyed parties and romance could be judged far more harshly than a man behaving in exactly the same way. Margaret lived at the intersection of old royal traditions and a rapidly changing society. Britain was changing. Young people were challenging old rules. Fashion was changing. Music was changing. Attitudes toward marriage and divorce were changing, and Margaret seemed to embody that transformation. She was royal, but she was also modern. She wanted tradition and freedom at the same time. And perhaps that contradiction was impossible to resolve. Her marriage to Antony Armstrong-Jones became a symbol of that contradiction. It began as a modern royal romance. It ended as a very public royal divorce. But between those 2 points were years of love, disappointment, family life, professional success, arguments, friendships, rumors, and emotional complexity. And that is why the marriage deserves more than a simple headline. Because Princess Margaret's story is not just about whether her marriage failed. It is about what happens when a human being is expected to live as a symbol. Think about that for a moment. From childhood, Margaret knew that her behavior mattered. She was not simply Margaret. She was the king's daughter. Then she became the queen's sister. Every relationship carried political and social implications. Every mistake could embarrass the family. Every act of independence could be interpreted as rebellion, and every emotional crisis could become entertainment for the public. Imagine trying to build a normal marriage under those conditions. It may have been impossible from the start. Yet Margaret kept trying, and that may be the most human part of her story. She wanted love. She wanted excitement. She wanted independence. She wanted to be taken seriously. And she wanted to remain part of the family an institution that had defined her entire existence. Those desires were constantly pulling her in different directions. Her relationship with Antony, therefore, became more than a marriage. It became a test. Could Margaret have a private life while remaining a public figure? Could Antony remain independent while married to one of the most famous women in Britain? Could the royal family accept a marriage that did not fit the old model? And could the British public accept that Princess Margaret was allowed to be unhappy? The answer, unfortunately, was complicated. The public wanted stories. The newspapers wanted drama. The palace wanted stability. Margaret wanted a life. And Antony wanted his own identity. Those interests did not always align. When the marriage ended, many people saw it as a scandal, but viewed from a distance. It can also be seen as something else. A woman who had spent her youth being told what she could and could not do eventually reached a point where she could no longer maintain a relationship simply because it looked good from the outside. That was significant. It showed that even inside the British monarchy, old rules were beginning to change. Margaret's divorce did not destroy the royal family, but it helped demonstrate that the monarchy was entering a new era. The generation that followed would face even greater scrutiny over relationships, marriage, divorce, and personal choices. In that sense, Margaret was ahead of her time. She lived through the transition between an older Britain and a newer one, and her personal life became part of that transition. There is a temptation to look back at old photographs of Princess Margaret and imagine that she lived a perfect life. The gowns, the jewels, the palaces, the glamorous parties, the famous friends, the royal ceremonies. But photographs cannot capture loneliness. They cannot capture regret. They cannot capture an argument behind closed doors. They cannot show someone wondering whether the person they married still understands them. And they certainly cannot show the pressure of knowing that millions of people are waiting to judge your next decision. That is why the reality behind Margaret's marriage is so much more fascinating than the polished image. The marriage was neither a perfect fairy tale nor a simple disaster. It was a relationship between two people who loved, frustrated, challenged, and ultimately separated from each other while living under extraordinary circumstances. And perhaps the biggest lesson from Margaret's life is that privilege does not eliminate human vulnerability. A palace cannot guarantee happiness. A royal title cannot protect a marriage. Fame cannot cure loneliness. And having everything the world can see does not mean you have everything you need privately. Princess Margaret spent her life surrounded by people. Yet some of her most difficult battles were deeply personal. Her story reminds us that public images are carefully constructed. What Britain was allowed to see was only part of the truth. The photographs showed the smile. The headlines showed the scandal. The official statements showed the dignity. But somewhere between all of those things was a real woman trying to navigate love, responsibility, disappointment, and freedom. And maybe that is why people remain fascinated by her decades after her marriage ended. Because Margaret was not easy to categorize. She was glamorous but vulnerable, rebellious but loyal, privileged but restricted, independent but deeply connected to the institution around her. And that contradiction made her one of the most unforgettable members of the modern British royal family. So when you look back at the wedding of Princess Margaret and Antony Armstrong-Jones, don't only look at the spectacular ceremony. Look at the people standing beneath the cameras. Look at the expectations surrounding them. Look at the world they were entering. And remember that a royal wedding is not necessarily the ending of a love story. sometimes it is where the real story begins. Princess Margaret's marriage was presented to Britain as glamour, modernity, and romance. But behind that image was something far more complicated. Two people trying to build a life while an entire nation watched. And perhaps the greatest tragedy was that the world was fascinated by their story while knowing almost nothing about what it truly felt like to live it. If you enjoyed this deeper look into Princess Margaret's life, don't just leave the story here. There are countless royal stories where the official version only tells half of what happened. So if you want more fascinating stories, forgotten details, and the human side behind famous historical figures, make sure you like this video, share it with someone who loves royal history, and subscribe to the channel. And most importantly, turn on notifications, because the next story may completely change the way you see another famous figure from history. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.